Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. I am Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer in the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. During these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the fascinating research being done by folks in the Hagley Library historical collections. One scholar is joining me today, Kelsey McNiff, Associate Professor of English at Endicott College, whose book project is tentatively titled Eight People of Some Talent with So Much Virtue, a portrait of the DuPont family at their arrival in the United States. Kelsey, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Oh, sure. Let's sort of dive into the big picture. What is your project about?
Well, my project is about the history of the early DuPont family, really with a focus on their experiences in 18th century France prior to their arrival in the United States. And I first became interested in the DuPonts in sort of an indirect way. I was working at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, and I was reading the papers of another woman who had emigrated from France to the United States in 1792, Marie-Jeanne d'Outremont. And she had originally come to the United States from France, settling in a French colony named Asylum in Pennsylvania, and then she ended up in Angelica, New York. And this is relevant because when she was in Angelica, she was friends with Josephine DuPont and Victor DuPont. And so as I was reading her correspondence, I would hear about the DuPonts. I would hear about Victor going to visit his brother Irénée. And so I became curious about who this DuPont family was, and pretty quickly realized that Irénée had started this gunpowder business that evolved into the modern day DuPont. And I begin with that because really when I became interested in the project, I became curious about the family's life and their experiences in old regime France and under the French Revolution. And as I started reading about them, I just found the characters really fascinating. There's a lot that's been written about Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, the family patriarch, who our audience might know was a well-known economist, a publisher, a politician in revolutionary France. His son Victor, who was a minor diplomat, and EI, of course, who, as is well known, studied under Lavoisier and helped manage the publishing business during the revolution and started the company. And I thought that hearing about their lives just really helped me kind of imagine and explore that period in French history. And as I read more, I noticed that in a lot of the literature, their journey to the United States in 1799 is a story that's sort of told and retold. And it became clear to me that the way the narrative was constructed really focused on Pierre Samuel, Victor, and EI, and only had sort of passing references to their wives, Françoise DuPont, Pierre Samuel's second wife, Josephine DuPont, who I've mentioned, and Sophie DuPont. And, the women might get mentioned briefly, and they're there as wives and mothers. We might get a quick biographical sketch, but we really don't see them as individuals. And similarly, the in-laws, Julienne and Jean Xavier Bureau de Pucy, who's Françoise's daughter and her son-in-law, are mentioned. Sort of, we know that Françoise and Jean Xavier go ahead to America to find a home. We know that Jean Xavier is involved in the business venture, but they just get the quickest of mentions. And as you mentioned, I'm an English professor and I specialize in the field of rhetoric and composition. But I have sort of an unusual background for an English professor because I began my career as a historian and I did my doctorate in modern French history. So one of the things I'm very interested in is a topic that sort of sits at the intersection of those fields. And we can refer to that as a topic of historical memory. So why why do communities remember some events in their past and not others? Why does some people's stories get told and remembered and others sort of get forgotten? So I became really interested in sort of the narrative of the DuPont family journey and thinking about who's included in those books that have been written and who's kind of been left out, and why, and what were their experiences. And so when I first came to the Hagley on my exploratory research grant, I really came with that goal of saying, what would it look like if we don't only focus on these three men who had these interesting lives and their experiences have been really well documented, but we also integrate and balance biographical narratives of the other family members who also were an important part of this family's journey and who themselves have really kind of interesting experiences that can help us learn about 18th century France as well.
Oh, that's great. Could you perhaps sketch the background of these family members in France, particularly the women, insofar as you've been able to uncover their stories?
Sure. So one thing that I found when I started looking into it more was even though the Josephine and Sophie, Victor and Ei's wives, weren't prominently featured in the, we can say, the historiography of the DuPont Corporation that's interested in the origins of the company, or in other DuPont family members' biographies. They have been the subject of some interest. It's just sort of been kind of separated from that. So there was a dissertation that was written that explored the DuPont family members' kind of immigrant identities, that talked about some of about Josephine and Sophie's backgrounds. There's also been some work with Josephine's interest in fashion and her correspondence with Margaret Manigault. And Bessie DuPont, as some of your audience might know, in the 1920s transcribed and translated all of Ei's correspondence, which includes these wonderful letters from Sophie. So I mention that to say that it's not that we don't know anything about them yet. So Josephine was the daughter of what we might call a sort of more impoverished aristocratic family, and she was very, very proud of her noble heritage. In her memoirs, she traced it back generations and generations. And in 18th century France, if you're a member of the nobility, further back you can trace that noble heritage, sort of the more esteemed it is. But she was orphaned at a relatively young age. She was born in Stenay, France, and she moved to Versailles as a girl. Her parents both had passed away by the time she was about 10 or 11. She was educated at a school in Versailles for other girls of the nobility in similar circumstances. And she was basically dependent both on sort of income that had a small income that had been left to her, and then eventually also a stipend from the Queen. And when the revolution breaks out, Josephine will leave Versailles. She'll go first to a convent in Paris where her sister is, but as we know, one of the first things that the leaders of the revolution did was seize church property. And so she goes to Switzerland, but only for a period of time. According to her, some of the work that's been done on her, she didn't want to stay there permanently. She didn't want to go further east as others were doing who were opposed to the revolution. She didn't want to be considered an emigre. So she came back to France, and she settled with one of her half sisters in a town called Ferrières. And that's where she met Victor DuPont. And so Josephine is this interesting, she's just an interesting character where she really gives us a window into sort of the life of a young noblewoman and someone who was not in favor, of the revolution. And so, we know, for example, when she and Victor began courting, she didn't want to have a civic marriage, which was basically the law at the time. So they had a secret marriage by the local village curé, and then they had the civic marriage. and she and Victor will go to South Carolina when has an appointment as a diplomat there in Charleston. So for me, it's sort of hearing more about her biography. Again, you can see how already it starts to add to our understanding of kind of this moment of the family and the family milieu, because she has a really distinct background and experience of that time compared to Pierre Samuel and his family. Sophie, EI's wife, we know a lot about her life once she and EI were married. She lived for the most part at a farm that they owned, Bois des Fossés, and she chronicled her daily activities, both raising her children and also helping manage the farm. So that part of her life gives us some good insight into women's experiences at the time and how active women were involved in sort of household management and economics in a sense, and sort of that component of the family business. I wish we could find out more about Sophie's background. I've tried, and there's really only a little that I've been able to come up with. We know that her family had come to Paris from Metz. It's reported that her father was either a tradesman or a shopkeeper. Haven't been able to find more information. We know that she and EI met in Paris. And when he was trying to get his father's permission to marry her, her status sort of as a petit bourgeois was a point of contention. It was seen as sort of marrying as sort of out of class. Yet the correspondence between EI and Sophie really seems like was a real love match. And we can talk more maybe in a moment about some of the sources that I found in that regard. Françoise, I find to be a fascinating character, and there is hardly anything about her in the literature on the Dupont family. You read book after book, and you'll see mentioned that she was the widow of Pierre Poivre, who was actually a very well-known French explorer who spent time in the Near East, was known being involved in the spice trade. But nothing is really written about her, or she's referred alternately as a sort of a rich widow, who thought Pierre Samuel was a genius. But even though there hasn't been much written about her here, there's actually been interest in her in France. And I've been able to find other collections of, manuscript collections, archival materials with a lot of her writing. And she just had this really interesting life that opens up a whole nother dimension of thinking about French society at that time. She was from Eastern France near Lyon. She married Pierre Poivre when she was 16, and he was, decades older than her. I think he was like 20, 30 years older than her. And he'd already had this whole experience in life as an explorer, and he'd come back home. And I believe his brother was married to her aunt. So there was this personal connection. And when she's 17, again, recently married, she's pregnant with her first child. Poivre, her husband, is appointed to be a colonial administrator in the French colony of Île-de-France, which now is known as Mauritius. She leaves home and she goes to board a ship at the sort of through the French East India Company at Port in Western France. And she goes to Mauritius, and she lives in Mauritius. Again, Île-de-France at the time, from 1767 until 1772. And that's where she has her first two children. Her husband becomes intendant of the island. He's known as an early environmentalist. And she has a correspondence with a famous French writer, Bernardin de Saint-Pierre, who writes his very famous novel, Paul et Virginie. And she's thought to be sort of the model for the heroine of the novel. And then she comes back to France in 1772, and she'll raise her family at the family's property near Lyon called La Freta. And Victor Dupont will go and visit them when he's on his tour as a young man trying to find a career. One of his stops is to see the Poivres at La Freta. And so we have letters that he wrote to his dad while he was there. I could go into more detail on her. She's very interesting. But eventually she and Pierre Samuel will connect again in the 1790s after her husband has passed away, and she wants to publish some of her husband's writings. And she and Pierre Samuel will marry in 1795. So what I'm trying to sort of sketch here is that then, when this decision is made for the family to emigrate, it's really conceived with sort of the broader conception of family at the time. There's sort of Françoise and her family and her son-in-law, Jean-Xavier Bureau de Puissy. He was a military engineer. He also was a politician during the French Revolution, like Pierre Samuel served as president of the French National Assembly. And in August 1792, when the Tuileries Palace is stormed and the National Convention is declared and Lafayette flees the country, Jean-Xavier Bureau de Puissy is one of the handful of people who leaves with him. So Jean-Xavier spends from about September 1792 until the summer of 1797, he's imprisoned, primarily in Austria. And so Françoise in this period has her daughter Julienne, who has a baby who hasn't met her father, right? Jean-Xavier in prison. He's released in 1797, but he can't come back into France. So I'm really interested both in kind of foregrounding and sort of recovering and telling those women's stories and telling them in that way, both so we can learn about sort of women's experiences in that era, but I'm also really interested in how telling presenting that kind of narrative can also enrich or complicate or sort of better help us contextualize what we already know about the early Dupont family and their history.
And that's fantastic. What materials at the Hagley Library did you look at to help you uncover this story?
So I'm hesitating because there's so much. One of the things, I came on the exploratory research grant to see what there was. And even after, poring over the online catalog and seeing what might be available, I still was astounded at just how extensive the manuscript collection is. And I think that's something that's just helpful for your audience to know. There's the Longwood manuscript collection, which has E.I., Victor, Pierre Samuel, Josephine, everyone's correspondence. And there's a Winterthur manuscript collection, which is just incredibly extensive. Some of that, as I mentioned, has already been transcribed and published. So I focused less on going through, for example, the correspondence of Sophie and E.I. in that era, because I know there's already a printed version. Similarly, it was really exciting to see Josephine's sort of autobiography, if you will, her memoirs in her own hand, to see those volumes. And that's something I'm going to look at more closely. And but some of that also has already been discussed also by Bessie Dupont in a volume about Victor and Josephine. But there were some things that really stood out as they were helpful or surprising. On that topic of E.I. and Sophie, for example, there's a letter in the volume, Bessie Dupont volume. It's a long letter where E.I. and Sophie have decided they want to marry, and E.I. is trying to persuade his father that he not only is ready to be married, and he kind of has a plan and his work will be steady, but also that sort of convincing him of Sophie's virtues and why she would also be a good wife. And so that letter is in the book, but when I was looking at the manuscript collection, I found that EI had done a draft of the letter, like a first draft of the letter. And you could see, and so as an English professor who teaches composition, this is something that was really wonderful to find. You can see him drafting ideas, crossing things out, redoing it, and really working through kind of what he wanted to say. And when you read the letter itself, it's very like sort of modern style of argumentation. He's sort of making claims and presenting evidence. And so that draft kind of gives us a sense of that thoughtfulness, and also how it really mattered to him. And so then when you see the final version, the final draft, in a sense, it's so neat. It's so clear. It shows a lot also about him thinking about his father as the audience, and what his father would expect and how he can really present it in a personal way. And so, it's really things like that that kind of capture my imagination and help me really imagine these individuals and humanize them. Another thing related to EI and Sophie, I was very surprised to find in Bessie DuPont's letters, I thought she did all of their letters. But I found that there's a whole collection of letters that she didn't include, which were their letters that they sent to each other before marriage. She started her book with the letters once they were married. So there are all of these like love letters that they wrote to each other. And there's so many of them that that you have in your collection. And they're these little sort of squares of paper. You can imagine they're in small pieces. And they are, one of the things I loved about them is you can see where they were folded. So you can see they're little pieces of paper that would have been folded into quarters or into eighths. So they would be just the right size that you could hold in your hand or fit in a pocket, right? As opposed to a more formal letter with its address and its stamp. And so those were really fun to find. And that's, again, something I'm excited to look through more in more detail. And then I'd say other things that stood out and that I know will be really valuable, again, where I've found, source material related to Françoise's life and other archival collections, but Hagley has a lot as well. There's letters that she sent to Victor and EI and to Sophie and Josephine at various points. For example, in April 1799, when she and Jean-Xavier are preparing for their voyage to the United States, she sent a whole series of letters to the family members, just telling them she's thinking of them and things she's sending to them. And she wrote these lovely letters to EI and Sophie's daughter, Victorine, and kind of reminded me of the kinds of letters my mom sends to my children, to her grandchildren. They're just really loving and doting. And there's also just some great material that really helps us also understand their role in the business venture, as investors. Pierre Samuel sending instructions to her and to Jean-Xavier, kind of about work they're going to be doing, with updates on how financial dealings in Paris to wrap things up. And so there's just a lot that really brings those different individuals to life. And it helps us see that their absence in a lot of the existing scholarship, it's not because there isn't documentation. In fact, there's some really interesting material. It really helps us see how kind of the narratives that have been constructed and repeated sort of due in part to the interest of those historians, the questions they were asking, then sort of what was relevant from their perspective. I look forward, honestly, to continuing to work with the material. I will, as I'm writing, I'll be continuing to be going through, and things that I've scanned or that I've brought back with me, a lot of the work of translation and transcription will be continuing. So I might have more to report later as in terms of others.
Wonderful. How has the trajectory of your project changed over time, perhaps particularly as influenced by having access to the materials at Hagley?
By trajectory, do you mean sort of timeline, or do you mean more kind of my own interests or goals?
Yeah, your interest, goals, the questions you're asking, the direction, so to speak, that you're taking in your work.
Yeah, sure. Well, as I mentioned, when I first came to the Hagley on my exploratory research grant, and as you noted, for example, in the sort of title of my project at the time, I really was imagining that the way I could address what I saw as those gaps in the historical record might be to have a book project that would try to integrate and sort of balance the narratives of these 8 family members as a way to kind of add in what hadn't been there before. And when I got to Hagley and was working more with the material, and as I've continued to reflect on what I found there, it has sort of shifted my goals, and for a few reasons. One is on a practical level, because of the extensiveness of the material and the range of topics individuals' experiences kind of raise, I decided that it would be challenging to have one volume kind of talk about everybody, and to be able to do it in a meaningful way that readers could also follow and keep track of things, if you will. But the other thing was that when I was there and I was working in the archives, I really found that I was most drawn to these women's experiences. And I really found that a lot of the material kind of brought them to life. And I think speaking just for myself, I know when I first began studying French history, I actually had found the history of the 18th century and the French Revolution less accessible than some other periods in French history. I think perhaps because the way it was taught sort of focused more on sort of social and political history. And I found that in working with these materials and learning more about these women's stories and seeing these really everyday moments that I think we can empathize with and relate to, even though their lives and the circumstances of their lives were so different from ours, it really felt like it kind of opened a window into this historical period and sort of, I think, created an opportunity where we can really learn a lot, not only about these women, but about kind of women's lives in 18th century France. And I realized that piece, that goal of better contextualizing these women's stories, because as I mentioned before, they're kind of here's a brief summary of their lives, but they don't situate them in their historical context. I think better contextualizing them and talking about their experiences in light of the historical context really creates an opportunity for readers to learn about and explore that period. And also I realized that my interest in addressing that gap or that sort of silence, if you will, in the historical record, it really was motivated by wanting my interest in the women's stories in particular. And so I found that the way it's kind of shaped the project is that it's made me focus more on that goal of foregrounding the women's stories and thinking about how that both allows us to kind of imagine and learn about this period. And also, as I mentioned before, how does it also allow us to kind of maybe think in new ways and enrich our understanding of the early DuPont family itself.
Kelsey, thank you so much for taking the time to share your work, and I can't wait to learn more as you bring the project full circle.
Oh, you're welcome, Greg. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And to the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts or more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, why don't you join us online at hagley.org. That's hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.